Looks like all the ID people aren't here. A couple of announcements before we get started. First is tonight is the opening of the student show. Fine arts, interior design, fashion design, 6 to 8, free food, right? But come and support your colleagues, right? These are your people doing it, right? The show will be up for the rest of the month. We're giving out prizes. So is Blue Ink. Some of the stuff is reproduced there. So 6 to 8 over in the Barry Gallery, which is the sort of the foyer to the auditorium around there, right? And like I said, free food and drinks. So please come. Everyone is welcome. The second thing is that I had announced by email without really thinking it through that the rest of the worksheets would be due this week, forgetting that you also had your progress report due this week. So if you haven't done the worksheets yet, don't worry about it till Monday. If you had, I'm sorry, right? But what's going to happen is over the weekend, I'm going to be trying to be grading the progress reports because you need those back soon in order to sort of make headway for the final paper. So I'm going to make the priority of grading that. And the worksheets I'll get back to you. I'm off to a conference next week, remember, right? So we'll talk more about this, right? That's my third announcement. So if you haven't done worksheets 6 on, right? I'll take it through Monday, okay? So prioritize for today, because today is the due date, isn't it? For the progress report, that should be your first priority. And I'm not going to grade them tonight because there's the student show opening. So if I get them before I start grading in the morning, I'm cool with that, right? I can't be on your case about being late if I'm late, right? And I have been sort of behind the game and getting things back to you. So I will not rain on your parade simply because I shouldn't judge you by different standards than you judge me. Now, that's really fair. So again, today progress reports, Monday, right? The worksheets. Okay? Cool. The other thing is, Elizabeth sort of made, I think I announced this, but maybe I didn't. I'm going to be at a conference from Sunday through Tuesday of next week. Right, I don't get back till late Tuesday afternoon or early evening. So that means that we won't have class on Tuesday. All right? And that was part of the reason to have all of those makeup lectures that were available on Canvas, right? Was to make up for the classes that we missed before and the one that was coming up. Okay? And that got us geared for that. So what it means is that I haven't seen you guys for like almost 2 weeks, right? Seems that way, doesn't it? And I ain't gonna see you again for another week and another week at least, right? So it's just a jittery time of year that way. Okay? So suffice to say that we've already done the makeup work. If you play back those recordings, you've already done the makeup work for Tuesday, right? But we won't be here on Tuesday. And I'll send out an email reminder, and they'll probably put something up on the door as well, right? In case, you forget, right? So you won't see me again until a week from today, right? Friday, whatever that day is, 13th. So, Friday the 13th, right? Will be the next time we see each other. Okay? So those are the 3 basic announcements. Student show, prioritize the progress report, worksheets are fine early next week. And we don't meet on Tuesday. All right? Questions on any of that? Yeah.
I don't know if it's not a time for a quick question on research in general.
Sure. Okay. Anytime. This is as good a time as any.
Okay, just really quick. So if they're, in my case, the woman we thought is pregnant, but it doesn't matter what it was,
whether or not the woman in your picture
is pregnant is questioned. So it doesn't matter what it is, but if it was a different question, that's my case. A lot of researchers are just assuming that she's pregnant, and then there's evidence to support that she's not. And so when I'm reading something and they're just assuming that, should I discount that whole? Shouldn't you as a researcher, don't you have a responsibility when you know that, or you just have not done the research?
Yes. Okay, so I want to try and frame the answer to your question in a way that helps everybody.
I know, I'm trying to, I'll just say that.
So basically, your question is, if you, in your research, come across alternative conclusions about something in your picture, one of which relies on evidence and the other of which does not. That's your basic question.
Yes.
How do you handle it? decide where you think, and you cite the evidence to support it, right? And you can, this is why I prefer footnotes. It's because in the footnote, you can even write, where you got the evidence to support it, then you can write, other people have suggested, without evidence, that blah, right? Okay, so the bottom line is it's about authority, right? And this is actually kind of a life skill in a way. If you get two people who are presenting you differing opinions on any particular subject, and one of them is armed with evidence, the other one just says this is so, who are you going to believe? And the problem is that we, as humans, have the knee-jerk reaction to believe the one that we agree with, and not the one that's presenting evidence to support the conclusion.
Do you discount that researcher as a whole when that happens?
I wouldn't discount everything they have to say,
Okay.
right? At all. And you and I can talk further. But yeah, yeah. Because she was pregnant a lot. She had 14 kids. So there's every chance, right? That Mrs. Vermeer. This is Vermeer, the woman with the scales. Is she pregnant or not, right? Kind of the same question with Mrs. Arnolfini. Is she pregnant or not, right? And there's evidence to suggest one way or the other. There's not evidence that she isn't, but there's no clear evidence that she is.
It just seems good that research would acknowledge that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Okay? So, again, if you get contradictory opinions, you can discuss it in your paper and footnote each of the different sources. You're working on Elizabeth. What's your opinion? Edward VI. So one person might say that the rattle is just a rattle with no symbolic significance. The other one might say that the rattle is meant as a stand-in for a royal scepter. And you can just discuss that in your paper. You don't necessarily have to have an opinion, right? This is what the evidence is presenting. And you can even make that part of your discussion. There's a whole group of people who say she's pregnant, none of whom present evidence, but note the ones that do. However, there are others who suggest that she isn't, and they use this particular evidence to suggest that. Okay? It's the humanities, and so as you might imagine, there's a difference in opinion when it comes to interpretation. Right? That's the point of interpretation, is it's evidence that leads to a conclusion, and those conclusions don't necessarily, it's not like math and science, right? Where the evidence leads kind of to one conclusion. What the evidence leads to is different interpretations in the humanities. So you might come across not just something as simple as that, but something bigger, right? And your presentation of the evidence that you've researched, and as you structure your paper, which is not due for another month, right, can in fact discuss the evidence, right? And you don't necessarily have to come to a conclusion. You're presenting the evidence. Right? This is, after all, an introductory level class. Right? Okay, so is that pretty clear? And I hope that made it helpful for more people than just Elizabeth. The other thing, I think, one last announcement. Next spring, there's upper division art history class, if you're not sick of this. FA 410 is topics in art history. And we do a different topic every term, and you can take it more than once. And the topics are usually based on works in local collections. So it's going to be Dutch Baroque, it's going to be Rembrandt, Vermeer, and we're going to Amsterdam for spring break. So if that's at all interesting to you, let me know. Just shoot me an email and say, I am interested, and I'll keep you posted. Because I would like to, it's going to be open to everybody, but I would like to reserve seats to usual suspects, right? My majors, other art and design majors, but it'll be spring break in Amsterdam for a very small cost, like $1,500 for airfare and lodging with breakfast, right? And museum entries and ground transport, all included. Probably less than we can buy an air ticket for, right? So that's spring 19. Heaven forbid, unless something horrible happens to me, right? That'll be happening. So if you're interested in that, shoot me an email. Say I'm interested. I'm keeping a list in my office, on my hard drive of people that have said they really would like to do this. And what I'll try and do is get you, before we open it up for general registration, manually add people first, right? So anyway, that's next spring. So I guess that's the fourth announcement. Now we'll shut up on the announcements because we'll never get to the art. Okay. So one of the things that was presented on the makeup lectures, which I hope you had a chance to play, and again, you need to play those, right? Was, and this is this curious phenomenon in French art from the 16th through the 19th century, which is that we see a sort of a back and forth, almost like a pendulum swing between two very different poles. So Renaissance art presented a very sort of flamboyant kind of art, right? When we talked about mannerism, we talked about its flamboyance. It's sort of over the top. It's very mannered. The poses are overinflated. You know, the body types are strange. It's expressive, right? And flamboyant. And then in the 17th century, almost in reaction to that, Baroque art, which tends to be relatively dramatic almost everywhere else in Europe, in France, Baroque art is much more restrained. What we call in art history classicism or classical, right? And that's a reaction against the previous generation, right? And part of that we can attribute to very particular external forces. The King of France was supporting mannerism in the 16th century. His grandson, maybe great-grandson, actually great-grandson, is supporting classicism in the 17th century. So patronage seems to drive this, but at the same time, it's a phenomenon beyond patronage that we see art, particularly in France, that artists tend to innovate by reacting against what the previous generation was doing, right? Don't want to do the same thing, same old, tired old thing, right? Do something different. And then as we move into the 18th century with Rococo, we swing back the other direction to something significantly more flamboyant, right? More expressive in a way. So this sort of interesting thing that we see, this back and forth between classicism and expressiveness, classicism and flamboyance, is a kind of an interesting phenomenon. And it doesn't end with Rococo. As we move to the end of the 18th century, we'll see a swing in the other direction, back toward classicism. And then as we move into the 19th century, we'll see a swing back toward a sort of more expressive quality. It's a fascinating sort of phenomenon in these centuries, these 3 centuries, right? And again, the move to Rococo from Baroque classicism can be explained by external forces. Rococo is associated with the reign of Louis XV, whereas classicism is associated with the reign of Louis XIV. And what Louis XIV had done, in addition to founding the Royal Academy, which we talked about online, the French Royal Academy, where he had artists trained in classicism, because that's the style he wanted for his court decorations, right? And he could pick and choose the best ones that came out of the academy to work for him. So Louis XIV supports this actively through the academy. Right? In addition to that, Louis XIV had moved the court of the King of France outside of Paris for the first time since the Middle Ages. Right? The royal throne, the royal seat was Paris. And Louis XIV moves it to the famous palace at Versailles, which you probably have heard of outside of an art history class, right? That's where the treaty was signed that ended World War I, right? With the Treaty of Versailles. At the end of his reign, Louis XIV's reign, Versailles kind of closes down. And his son, Louis XV, moves back to Paris, the traditional home to the French royalty. And with him move all of the aristocrats. They had gone to be around Louis XIV, had set up chateaus in the countryside around Versailles. Right? Versailles, like 40 miles outside of Paris, not that far. Right? And when Louis XV relocates back in Paris, all of these courtiers and aristocrats build new chateaus back in Paris, or around Paris. And Rococo is the style that they choose to decorate these new chateaus. Right? So the pendulum swing that we're talking about has some external forces. At the same time, there's some internal artistic forces about sort of reacting against what Dad had done by going in a different direction. And the fascinating thing is the direction, the new direction that people choose is usually just an older direction again, right? So, heck with dad, let's go to granddad, right? What's the word we want for that? There's not recidivism, that's repeat offenders. Something, atavism, I think is the term for this, right? Where you look atavistic outlook as you look back to your grandparents, right? And that's what we see artists doing in this period. Now, it's important to remember that the Rococo patrons, the people who are paying for this, are buying these pictures of themselves at play. The traditional Rococo theme is these aristocrats enjoying the benefits of their wealth, never working, always playing, and usually in love, right? And that's the theme of the vast majority of Rococo pictures, are amorous pursuits in gardens of palaces, sometimes by the aristocrats themselves, sometimes by gods and goddesses, right? At the same time, these same people are commissioning and buying pictures of their servants. And it's a sort of drastic contrast because they get to play. The servants do not, right? The servants are dutiful, diligent. They show the virtue of hard work. And of course that makes sense because if you're an aristocrat, that's what you want to see your servant doing, right? You don't want them goofing off, right? Sleeping. You want to see them going about their duties because that's what they're paid to do, right? So Chardin's work, The Attentive Nurse, is, again, this is discussed online, is also a Rococo work, but in a very different spirit, much more sedate, much more restrained, because oftentimes our attempts to generalize, right, to say this is what's going on in a particular period, it's never that easy. There's offshoots, right? Things don't fit our plans as easily as we might want them to. As we look at Chardin and this image of domestic virtue and a sort of more restrained approach to art, what we're going to find as we look toward the end of the end of the 18th century, is that this more restrained approach becomes the dominant style. So a reaction against Rococo, the pendulum swings the other direction a bit. And as we look at late Rococo art, one of the things we need to remember is that this is taking place during the Enlightenment. This is a period of French philosophy, of a reawakening of human consciousness. Right? That's how Doré painted. And it's a period that's dominated, not entirely, but dominated by a group of French philosophers who are known as the philosophes, which is just the French word for philosopher, les philosophes, right? French philosophes. And they're writing on a number of different topics, but one of the things that they're interested in is something very similar to the Renaissance. They want to look back toward sort of the glory days of the past. And I think that this was on one of the worksheets when we talked about Renaissance art. That when we get to the 18th century, the interest of looking back to the past is different, right? That it's more moralizing. It's where we get the idea that the old adage that those who do not study the past are doomed to repeat it. That's sort of what Voltaire said, right? The great philosopher. He said we should study the past, and what we should do as we study the past is figure out how to navigate our present better, right? Learn from historical narratives, right? Stories from history. Learn from it ways to behave when encountering particular kinds of situations, right? And the whole point for Voltaire and the philosophe is that Enlightenment study, this revival democratizing of thought and ideas, would make each one of us a better citizen. And I think this is why it is so attractive in a college setting. Is because one of the things that we hope that you sit in our history class and you learn a little something about broadening your horizons and think about things in a way you hadn't thought about them before, and you encounter things in your world and you think about it differently. You become a more engaged, less passive, more active, engaged and thoughtful participant in your world rather than this sort of passive promote that things happen to, right? And we think that all education, I'm just saying this because you're here, right? That all of your education, what's the point of coming here to get a degree in X, Y, or Z, right? Nursing, interior design, whatever, and having to sit in this stupid ass class, right? Or a history class, or a comp class. What's the point of all of that? The point of all of that is that there's more to being an active, engaged member of the citizenry of a community than simply being a specialist in one thing or another. That you should, this education, university, the universe of all ideas, opens your horizon, expands your thinking, and you become a better person because of it. That's why I always say, damn it, get engaged, don't just sit there, because this is your opportunity to actually become something better than when you started here, right? 4 years out. You don't just get a degree and get a better job, and goodness knows we hope you do that, right? But you become a better person. It's an opportunity, right? So anyway, so it comes out of the enlightenment. That's a bit of an aside in my little educational soapbox thing, right? I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe it, because goodness knows they don't pay as much, right? So the philosophes are behind this idea of the Enlightenment, that there's more to, there's something to be said for being a good citizen, and education plays a part in that. And as we look at Chardin's images of domestic virtue, here's a nurse dutifully going about her care for an unseen, presumably invalid patient, right? Is she preparing an egg, right? She got the bed warmer, bread, right? What she's doing, of course, is she's an engaged member of a microcosm, right? And that there is virtue in work, right? In hard work well done. Another great message for us all, right? There is virtue in hard work well done. Yeah? So we have to keep in mind that the Enlightenment is flourishing at the same time that Rococo is kind of working its way through, and as we'll see, is on the wane, right? The Enlightenment led, under the sort of the leadership of Voltaire, the Enlightenment led to an interest in studying history for examples of that kind of virtue. And what Voltaire called them, and you don't need to be in Latin 101 to figure that out, exemplum virtutis, right? Examples of virtue drawn from history, right? An exemplum virtutis. And in fact, when he expresses this in Latin, suggests to us something about it, which is that Voltaire didn't want you to really, he advocated studying history, but he really advocated studying periods of history that were dominated by rational thinking, right? So he didn't have much time for the Middle Ages, because that's a period of faith versus reason. He had much more respect for ancient Rome, ancient Greece, the Renaissance, right? These were the periods for him of great rationality. He also quite liked Poussin and the 17th century France because of classicism that we see there, right? But he advocated looking back at historical moments. And hopefully by studying these, we can find virtuous examples, exemplum virtutis, right? Ways in which we might apply a lesson to what's going on today. Okay? So the Oath of the Horati. I always mean to change the title because he didn't title things that, but Horati with a double I is a plural in Latin, right? Horatius is the old man, and the Horati are his three sons. Okay, the sons of Horatius, the Horati family. That's all about Latin plurals, right? So this is where the sons of Horatius take a vow to fight their enemy to the death for the honor of family and country. And the scene comes from the very earliest period of Roman history, around the 7th century BC, when Rome, a city, was still governed by tyrannical kings. Right? This is before the empire. And if you know Roman history very briefly, right, there was this period governed by tyrannical kings. They are overthrown, and Rome enters into what's called the Republic, representative government, right? Had to be an aristocrat, but still was at least quasi-democratic, right? And that lasts up until Augustus, time of Julius Caesar, his murder on the Senate floor, at which starts the sort of the third great period of Roman history, which is the empire, where Rome is not governed by elected governments, but people who either inherited it from dad or killed the guy in office. Right? This is before any of that. This is 7th century BC, where Rome is struggling to free itself from tyrannical oversight by kings, right? And the Horatii are going to fight for freedom, right? The sons of Rachel are vowing to fight for freedom. And it's sort of clan warfare. There's another family they're fighting against. Typical for historical accounts. There's a nice parallelism. There are 3 sons of Horatius. There are 3 sons of the warring family, right? They're going to fight until death, and it's a pretty great story as well, right? So the 3 sons are, I'll tell you a little bit more about the story in a second. They're vowing now to take up arms, right? And the father is consecrating the swords to the gods before they go out into battle, right? And what Jacques-Louis David has done is to use the composition in a really organized way. Everything's thought through. It's very clean, it's very orderly, it's very classical, right? Not flamboyant, not rococo. So our 3 sons on the left are sort of in lockstep, that symbol for their agreement, right? And their arms sort of staggered as they make their vow. And you'll notice if you look at the arrangement of the 3 arms and look at the arrangement of the 3 swords, and you see there's a parallel there, right? And David wants you to view that, to take that away. The realism in the scene is a little bit hard. If you hold swords like that, you end up without fingertips, right? I mean, you cannot hold the sword by the blades and up to the gods. But if you held them by the hilts, it wouldn't work as well, right? So he sacrifices that. 3 archers in the back, 3 women on the right, right? David has worked everything together to sort of tell this story. And this interest in ancient Rome as an exemplum virtutis, right, is part of this sort of late 18th century style that is a reaction to Rococo, that historians now refer to as neoclassicism, new classical interests, right? And it's tied directly to our philosophe, and in particular to Voltaire. It might seem odd to us in the 21st century to think about how a philosopher might impact society that much, but that's just how different things were in the 18th century, right? They didn't have Netflix to distract them, right? So David is probably the prime example of neoclassicism, right? Now this is, like I said, it's a really cool story. So the 3 brothers are going to fight against these other enemy 3 brothers, right? What they don't know is one of the daughters, one in blue, is secretly engaged to one of the enemy sons, right? So what David does is, I think the women know, but the boys don't, right? That this poor woman in the foreground is either going to lose a brother or a fiancé, right? Which puts her in this horrible position, yeah? And the story as it plays out is that they go to battle, 2 of the brothers are killed, the 3rd one wounded, right? And it looks like they're losing, and the 3 enemy brothers are still alive, but they're wounded too. And the 3rd brother, the surviving Horatii brother, comes up with this amazing plan. This is such a great story. He turns and runs, which is obviously what you wouldn't do if you're a hero, right? But he's got a plan. He turns and runs, and as he turns and runs, the 3 enemy brothers chase him. But because they're wounded, they can't run as a group. And they slowly but surely stagger out, right, in the line following him. And then he turns on a heel and takes after him. And he gets them one by one, right? And he kills 2 of them. He says, that's for my 2 dead brothers. And he gets the 3rd one. He says, and this one's for my home, this is where the story gets a little weird, right? Goes back home, sister's like, you killed my fiance, and he goes, never, it sounds like the Godfather, never takes sides against the family, he says, he kills her too, right? That's Roman history, it's all written by men, right? Bottom line is, right, okay, exemplum virtutis, what is the example of virtue here? Arguably, there are some causes that any sacrifice is worth. The fight for freedom against tyranny is a cause that is greater than personal concern. Right? That is arguably the exemplum virtutis here. Right? That there's sometimes you have to sacrifice everything you hold dear, even your own life, even your own family, to fight for an ideal that is greater than any personal concern. Right? Service. Look at the date on this. This was hung, right? We're talking about the French Royal Academy. Louis XIV founded the French Royal Academy in 1648. One of the things the French Royal Academy did was to house annual art shows. And again, everybody went, right? Tonight, Marshall, they called them the salon. Actually, they're biennial every 2 years. A biennial salon, right? And the salon had pictures hung, juried by the leaders of the Royal Academy, to choose the best ones, usually thousands of pictures, 1,500, 2,000 pictures, right? And at the salon, they would give out prizes, right? Prizes for the best newcomer, prizes for the best picture, and people would buy works of art as well. So it was a great opportunity. Okay? David's picture was shown at the salon in 1785. Okay? The biennial salon held in 1785. If you know your French history, you realize where we are in history here. 1785, we are within 4 years of the French Revolution. And the idea is that this picture traffics in, right? The idea is that this picture is putting forth fight against tyranny at all costs is an idea that people are picking up on in 1784, 1785. That exemplum virtutis is a key element of taking something you learned from ancient Rome and applying it to contemporary issues, contemporary ideas. Right? Take up arms to fight against tyranny. And within 4 years, that's exactly what the people of France will do. And in 1789, after their revolution, they hold another salon that same fall. You might know this, the French Revolution is in July, right? July 14th is there July 4th, right? That fall, they hold a salon in 1789. David puts this picture back in the salon, right? Re-exhibits it at the request of the revolutionaries, because he's been friends with them all along, right? David's right in the thick of history, and he's a member of the party that sponsors the revolution. Right? And when he puts this picture back in, I wish I had it to show to you. He had this massive, unfinished picture of the revolutionaries swearing to fight against the king. Right? And they're assembled on this tennis court. He's got the drawing done. It's going to be like 20 by 30 feet. Right? Never finishes it. And in the corners, they're swearing is that exact same pose. Right? So you've seen that exact same parallel. Right? I should have brought it in for you. Okay? So exemplum virtutis, a high, important part of neoclassicism, is this idea that we're going to study history, not all of history, not any history, but in particular those periods that are governed and dominated by rational thinking. Even though you might argue that killing your sister for being engaged in somebody secretly ain't all that rational. Right? So, French Revolution, 1789, I forget I have these text boxes coming up. After the revolution, right, the revolutionaries split into two parties. One was more radical than the others, and David was part of the more radical party, right? And very, very good friends with Robespierre, if you know your French history, right? He knows Robespierre, who's the leader of the Jacobins, which is the radical party. After the revolution, the king, of course, is dethroned and beheaded, right? So is Marie Antoinette. There's a drawing by David of Marie Antoinette handcuffed to a chair on her way to get her head cut off, right? He was there at the time. He was a witness to all of this. In 1793, 4 years into the new system, right? The post uh, monarchical, post-royalist system. The French went on a rampage. The Jacobin Party went on a rampage, which is now known as the Terror. And they started beheading all of the aristocrats. Anybody that was at all associated with the French throne on one level or another, going to have their heads cut off all through France. And they set up special places to do it in every town and every city. If you walk around France today, go to the Place de la République, the place of the Republic. That's where they did it, right? And they came up with a great new system to make it a little bit more efficient, the guillotine, which was, by the way, still being used in like the 1970s. Can you believe that? Right? But an efficient way of whacking off all these heads. So I read somewhere it's like 10,000 people, maybe it's 30,000 people in a month throughout Paris. The streets were running with blood. It was really kind of a horrible situation and soured many people's ideas as to what the revolution was really going to do. Right? David's right in the thick of this. Okay? The revolutionaries in the year of the Terror commissioned from David a painting of one of their martyrs. And I think in many ways it's intended as propaganda to say, look, yes, we're killing thousands of people, but it's not like we're not suffering as well. And Marat, who was friends with David, was assassinated by a pro-royalist faction. Now, as we trace our way through French history, which we're going to be doing quite a bit in the next couple of weeks, we have to remember that when the monarchy is out, that doesn't mean that everybody thinks they should be out, right? There are resistance movements against the leader. And so during a period after the revolution, when the first French Republic is getting started, there were royalist factions, people who wanted to see the kings restored to the throne. Marat was a journalist. He wrote extensively on the rights of the common man. Right? His ideas, his publications were some of the things that fed the sentiments that led to the revolution in the first place. And he continued to write afterwards about how important the works of the rights of the common man were. Everyone has equal. This is an Enlightenment idea. Right? He had a skin condition. He had horrible eczema all over his body. And he was forced, in order just to simply sort of make it through the day without being in utter pain, he sat in an ointment bath. Right? A bath filled with water mixed with oils that would make the eczema not itch and burn. Right? Over his body. But he didn't let this stop him from working. So again, it's this idea of diligence and hard work, right? He sets himself up this nifty little writing table over the bath so he can write while he's in the bath. And he's presented a letter by someone who's disguising themselves as the poor. I'm very, very sad. It would make me happy if I could see you, right? When in fact she's an agent sent by the royalists to silence Marat, right? To stop him from writing by killing him, right? And he holds a letter from her that implicates her. Apparently, David was able to get into the crime scene. The sketch of the head was made from the cadaver, from the corpse, right? And the woman who killed him, named Charlotte Corday, didn't even try to run away. She wanted to be caught, right? This was making a statement, right? But here is Marat, as Stephen says, in honor of Marat, and signed by David at the bottom. L'an 2, the second year of the new republic, right? And Marat has been killed here. He's carrying a quill pen. There's another with an ink pot on the table. And I love the pairing of the pen with the knife. Like, it's not going to matter. The pen is mightier than the sword, right? His writings will live on well past today, right? Now, David's job here with this picture is to make Marat noble, to make him an innocent victim, a martyr to the cause, right? That's what he's going to try to get across. And so on a certain level, the white of the sheet adds to the sense of innocence of the victim, right? He heightens the drama by making it kind of quasi-Caravaggio, right, with the light shining down on his body. He makes him probably more muscular than an eczema sufferer who lived in the tub ever was, right? Not burly, not Michelangelo or Rubens, but slightly more muscular. And then he models that pose after the common pose for Jesus after he's been killed. Right? A pietà is a word that artists use for an image of the Virgin Mary lamenting the passing of her son. Right? Famous Michelangelo work in St. Peter's in Rome. Right? And you can see the degree to which David is actually quoted quite a bit from this. The slung arm in particular as a sign of martyrdom, but also the hand holding the letter. It very much follows the pose of Christ's other hand. Right? It's a pietà without the Virgin Mary. Yeah? And that's David's way of assuring that we know that Marat is a martyr. Right? Not just a victim, but in fact a martyr to a greater cause. And just like Jesus died for our sins, right? Marat died for our freedom. Great parallel being used there. And it highlights, again, this issue that we find with neoclassicism. One, there's the idea of exemplum virtutis, which is not really here. Might be. Second, there's an interest in ancient Rome, right? Or at least past periods dominated by rationality, right? And so his Horati picture borrows a classical scene. This one borrows a Renaissance composition, right? These are hallmarks of neoclassicism. Look to the art of the past to amplify the message of the work. Don't just choose prototypes willy-nilly, but choose them in a way that actually makes the work have stronger, deeper meaning, right? Well, like I said, David's right in the thick of it. We have a really wonderful David downtown. We'll get there in just a second. He was friends with Napoleon. He met him while Napoleon was in Italy. David met him. Napoleon was a general at the service of the Republic while the Republic is getting founded in the early 1790s. Napoleon is on military campaign helping to colonize other regions of the Middle East for the French. So he goes to what is today Israel, right, what was then called Palestine. He conquers Egypt. Right? This is the period when, in fact, in French furniture, you start to see an interest in sphinxes and stuff, because Napoleon had conquered Egypt. Right? He's out there expanding the borders of France. And as the Republic gets started in the early 1790s, right, eventually, because of the warring factions we talked about, right, there were different factions within the revolutionaries, there's a military coup to overthrow the standing republic, and they decide that they want Napoleon to be the leader, the consul of France, in an overthrow in the late 1790s, in 1799, right? So an overthrow, put Napoleon in charge, he's out there doing good work for the French. And David paints this picture as a commemoration of the triumphal return of Napoleon, right? He's been in Italy, he's been fighting for France, he's been called back, right? Flipping the military service into political service. He will become the ostensible leader of France, which was called at that point the first consul of France, right? So here he is coming back into France, and David again wants to make this into sort of propaganda, visual propaganda. And you can see he's swept from the back. There's a tailwind. Nature is bringing him back, right? He is a force of nature coming into France. He's being swept up the hill as he crosses the Alps, right at the Pass of St. Bernard. He's carved his name in the rocks. Bonaparte, right? Right next to the names of two other people who crossed the Alps in triumph, Hannibal and Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus. So David is now depicting him coming back, and he's totally propaganda because we know he's riding a mule, right? And instead he puts him on this fiery horse, pointing to the heavens as he comes back now in triumph, right? Again, neoclassicism, he looks back to ancient art for prototypes, the rearing horse and the easy stead in the saddle comes directly out of a famous frieze from the Parthenon, from ancient Greece, which was still in Greece at this time, not in London where it is now. Right? So he's picking up on classical prototypes to make Napoleon something more timeless. Right? So David is the painter of great historical moment. Now you know what happens with Napoleon? He's first consul to begin with. He's president, ostensibly with a term limit. Right? What happens to Napoleon? Do you know? Eventually, yeah, but before that. He becomes emperor. That's exactly right. It's this great irony that the French fought to overthrow the monarchy, and what was the direct outcome of that? Was, because emperors are here and kings are here. They get rid of the king and they end up with an emperor instead. Right? Someone who, from his military service, has designs on making Europe all governed by Napoleon. Right? This is, by the way, what Hitler called the Second Reich. Right? This is certainly modeling. I don't understand why people still love Napoleon. Because really, he wants to conquer all of Europe. He wants to make he eventually conquers Spain, right? Parts of Germany. He's going to try and turn the entire European continent into Napoleon's realm, right? So he's crowned emperor. It's a fascinating thing. David paints that as well. This painting is, I've got the scale of it here, right? Where is it? Maybe I don't. Roughly, the figures are life size in this painting. It's huge, right? It's about 40 feet across the base. And this is the coronation of Napoleon. And Napoleon, as he becomes emperor, is going to pick up the mantle of the Middle Ages. There were emperors in the Middle Ages as well, the Holy Roman Emperor, right? And Napoleon wants to be seen as the new Holy Roman Emperor, the leader of all of Europe. And the old Holy Roman Emperors were crowned by the Pope. So on the norm, in the Middle Ages, the emperor would go to Rome and receive his crown from the Pope because being emperor was tightly tied to the church, right? You needed the church's backing for people to follow you. So Napoleon wants to follow this, but he doesn't like the idea that he receives his crown from the Pope. Because that makes him subservient to the Pope, right? And in the Enlightenment period, this isn't necessary. So he instead summoned the Pope to come to him. The Pope came to Paris to crown Napoleon. And that's the scene we see here. The coronation of Napoleon is in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. And the fascinating thing about what David does, because again, with all of these images, he has to make it work for Napoleon. What happened in the ceremony? Does anybody know what happened in the ceremony? Rather than me just tell you? Okay, so you're going to be my actor. So, on the norm, what happened? Napoleon would come and kneel, and the Pope would stand above him on the stairs, and he would go and put, say the stuff and put the crown on his head. And what happened is Napoleon now kneeling and looking up and getting it, and he realized at the last minute that if I let him do this, I'm still getting it from him. So he reaches up and grabs the crown out of the Pope's hand, puts it on his own head. So he has crowned himself, right? Never happened before. That is not what David depicts. He depicts Napoleon now turning around and giving the crown to his wife Josephine, right? So again, it's cleaned up propaganda, right? And David was here. In fact, that's him there. in the back, right? David was there watching this take place because he's tight with Napoleon, right? So starting in 1803, this is when the coronation of Napoleon takes place. Napoleon is, for the next 12 years, the Emperor of France. But, as you said, Susanna, yeah, he's killed. Everybody is. Well, everybody dies eventually, right? But he's overthrown finally in 1815 by the British, who are really good about making sure that the people who want to take over all of Europe don't get a chance to take over all of Europe. You know, I watched Dunkirk this summer, and the same sort of idea, right? We will never surrender and all of that. Well, all of this leads us somewhere local, right? We've got one of the great portraits of Napoleon down at the National Gallery. It's a life-size portrait of Napoleon in his study at the French Royal Palace. The Tuileries is the French Royal Palace. And it's as if he's been surprised by us, and he turns to greet us in his military uniform, that pose that you've come to so associate with Napoleon, with his hand warming inside of his coat pocket, a bunch of cloth in his other hand, having risen directly from his chair with his back to us, his sword laying on the chair, about to put it on. Right? And what David is going to try and do here is tell us something about Napoleon. It's not just a picture of what it looks like. It's meant to be an illustration of who he is. Right? The pose, I couldn't find a direct example, but basically is a variation on good old contrapposto posing that we talked about in the Renaissance, that derives itself from classical Greek sculpture, that sort of perfected figure at rest with the potential for action. So again, a neoclassical work, right? Part of neoclassicism is turning to the works of the past to amplify ideas about the works of the present. It's painted in really great detail. There's his sword, his royal throne with various symbols of royalty, the orb with stars, the bees, which were a take on the French fleur-de-lis, also a royal symbol. We see the French fleur-de-lis on the bound book at the top by his elbow, gold against the blue ground. That goes back to the Middle Ages. And that's his writing desk. And we can see what he's been working on because there are words here and there. Code, you can see. Same word in French. He's writing the code of law. Right? He's a man of intellectual distinction. Right? And we see down below maps, books. It's signed Jacques J.D. David, J.O. David on one of the maps at the bottom. And he rises to greet us from a night of study. Right? And David is pretty good about telling us more about his character with this. Behind his other elbow, we see a desk lamp. Right? And you'll notice that it's a candelabra, and that most of the candles are burned out. Right? And the one directly beneath his elbow has just gone out, and there's smoke wafting up. The one next to it is almost burned out as well. This is to tell us that he's been working for a very long time. In fact, he's been working through the night. Right? We have a saying, burning the candle at both ends. Right? We talk about when we're studying for cramming for exams. We're out burning the candle at both ends. Right? We get burned out more quickly that way. Napoleon's been burning the candle down, right? Staying up all night, and he puts a clock in the back to tell us that this is the first thing in the morning. This is, 13 minutes after 4, right? It's not the afternoon. And he is now rising from his work because we've come into the room. He addresses us directly. And we think that what he's doing is he's actually rising from that work so he can go out and review the troops as they get up with revelry first thing in the morning, right? Go out and see they're all tucked in and everything like that, right? They've got their uniforms on properly. So David is a key player in French politics at this time. It's important to remember that he's right in the thick of it all the way through the end of Napoleon's reign. And in fact, when Napoleon is deposed in 1815, David has to flee France because he was so closely associated with Napoleon. Ends up going to Brussels, which is where he spends the last years of his life in exile, right? Because of these political connections. Now, Jacques-Louis David ran the biggest training ground for artists, the biggest studio in all of Paris. A great number of the next generation of artists studied under Jacques-Louis David. The apprentice system was still there, right? You still learned to grind your pigments as a kid before you entered the Royal Academy, right? To finish off your studies. And David had a great number of pupils. One of them, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres is pronounced Ang, right? Almost like anger, but not quite Ang. Hang is, I guess, the closest to it, right? The word hang. Ang was one of David's pupils. Studied directly under him. And in 1801, Ang puts a work into the Royal Academy Salon. And one of the things I mentioned that the Royal Academy did was they would give out prizes. And one of the prizes, one of the highest prizes you could get was the Rome Prize, the Prix de Rome. And Ang won this in 1801 with a painting. Now, the Rome Prize make you salivate. The Royal Salon sent you to Rome on their dime for 2 years, all expenses paid. Go live in Rome, because Rome is where the hotbed of art was, right? The center of the Renaissance, the center of Roman art. Go and study the classics, right? Profit from the experience on us. It would be nice if we had something like that. Nice big endowment we could give, for our student show tonight. I'm giving the best in show $50. This is what we can afford. Is that kind of a prize? It would be nice if we could say, okay, fine, here you go. Go study art here. Show us what you come up with. Ang won the Prix de Rome in 1801, goes to Rome. Napoleon, remember, had conquered Italy, right? He had crossed the Alps back to become emperor. That meant there was a whole lot of French people living in Italy in the 18th century, around 1800. When Ang gets there in 1801 with the money from the Royal Salon, he sets up shop for 2 years, and he's able, with all of these French patrons under Napoleon still there, he's able to stay there for the next 20 years, right? Works out of Rome and begins to study Italian Renaissance art. He uses it as an opportunity to sort of see everything he can see, right? And he adopts a lot of things from his studies into his pictures. Okay? In particular, he loves Raphael, absolutely adores Raphael. If we had more time, I'd show you some pictures that he painted of the life of Raphael, where he sort of made things up about the life of Raphael, which are kind of fun. But he also loves Titian. He just adores Titian, right? A great Venetian painter. And what he gives us is a sort of altered variation on a typical Titian type. Now, if you look at this, there's Venus on her couch. And from the waist up, she's sort of like our Venus that we saw with the mirror and Cupid from the National Gallery, right? Cupid putting a crown on her head, right? It borrows from that time, but she's put into this setting in her boudoir where she is playing a duet, making music with the kid on the left. And it's a totally eroticized picture. She's holding a pipe. Hello, Freud, right? The music is right in front of her. He's stroking a fat-bellied lute. Hello, Freud, right? And looking directly at her nakedness for his inspiration. He's not looking at the music, right? This is a totally typical Titian, though. Remember the shepherd and the musician in the countryside? Same sort of idea, right? And Titian did 4 or 5 different versions of this, right? And these are the sorts of things that Ang is now translating. You can see a great number of elements are sort of plunked, altered into this. Instead of Venus, we have this luxuriantly long-haired woman reclining on the ground. Instead of the lute player, we have our Middle Eastern musician, right? And the rest of the details is it opens up to the background behind red curtains, opens to the landscape behind it, again, directly kind of borrowed from Titian. We see a servant or a guard. And all of this flips it from being a mythological scene, Titian, right, into being a scene of the Middle East, of Arab life in the hands of Aang. And after Napoleon conquered Egypt, there became this taste for exotic images of the Middle East, particularly in France, right? And Aang is supplying that, right? Making images that add to that. Numerous paintings on the theme of the odalisque. And odalisque, right, the term originally meant, it had to do with the Sultan's harem. Okay, you know about sultans, and a harem was the bevy of women that were courtesans to the Sultan, okay? Lovers to the Sultan, that were kept in the harem, which was exclusive to the Sultan. No one else could go there but him, okay? Odalisque, originally, the term referred to the servants of the harem girls, right? The servants of the courtesans. But it came to be used for everybody, right? So by Aang's time, odalisque meant courtesan in a harem, right? And that's what both of these are. Part of the group of, elite group of women that provided sexual service for the Sultan. Okay? And like I said, there are numerous versions of these. And in each one of them, Aang is trying to make it as exotic as possible. Whether it's through fabrics, furs, it's a lot about tactile and touch. Smells, there's a hookah pipe at the feet of the blue one on your left. Feathers, that hair that's spilling out of the Walters piece on the right from Baltimore. Right? The sounds that we hear, it's all very, very exoticized, right? And eroticized as well. At the Phillips collection, we have an image of a bather, quite a few of these, and they too are evoking the idea of the harem, right? All these women bathing together, and we are given this view of them that is usually exclusive for the Sultan. Right? It's a privileged view. Normal people don't get to see this. And again, this interest in all things Arab, all things Middle Eastern, came from the politics of the time. It began with Napoleon invading Palestine, invading Egypt in the 1890s. It moves from there to France in the 1830s, colonizing Algeria. Became a French colony, right? This is after Napoleon. And Algeria remained a French colony all the way till the 1960s. It's only in the early 1960s that Algeria is free from French control. That colonization, that introduction to non-Western customs, inspired a taste, a demand for works of art that would present that to them. And what's interesting as we look at these works of art is the degree to which we call it Orientalism, this interest in the Middle East, right? Orientalism, an interest in all things Middle Eastern, right? It could even apply to all things Far Eastern eventually, but at first it's primarily the Middle East. What's interesting as we look at these images that are produced to fulfill this market demand is that the range of images, the range of subject matters is pretty limited. And the majority of the images that we see tend to show Arab life in a negative light, at least by 19th century European standards. They don't show us positive things happening. We see women as sex slaves. underscoring that the leadership of these regions are decadent, sensual, right? Unbridled in their sexuality. We see images of warfare. We see images of flesh markets, people being bought and sold as slaves. All presented incredibly realistically, as if to say this is the way it really happened. And it's not what the artist set out to say, we are going to degrade Arab culture. But rather it's part of the ideology of the time. Wherein, as France is colonizing this region, there's a sense that it has to be justified. How do you justify colonization? How do you justify removing local leadership and instilling your own instead from outside? You have to say that that local leadership ain't working, that it's wrong to be governed that way. These images of odalisques undermine the authority of local leaders, help to justify the French's own colonization of those regions. And this is something that we still see today. If you think about how particular groups are stereotyped in media, in movies, right? Where do we see a realistic, rounded, complete picture of things from the outside? Right? This issue of Orientalism is a very, very strong one in the 19th century art. We'll see it again next week. But it certainly also is something that continues into the 20th century. We'd like to think we're past it, but those ideologies still govern how we think. And often how particular people are portrayed by outsiders. Right? And that's certainly the case here. Now, with our last 10 minutes or so, we'll look at the spread of neoclassicism. Right? We don't see it only in France, we see it in England as well. One of our few women artists, there was one on one of the makeup lectures in Holland in the 17th century. Here's Angelica Kauffmann, born in Switzerland, has moved to England, also giving us a scene from ancient Rome, 2nd century BC, in this sort of neoclassical setting. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this was a Jacques-Louis David, because it has that same sort of dry, clear, undramatic placement of the figures. Okay. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, again, Latin plurals. An I is a plural of US. So she's the wife of Gracchus, and she's the mother of Gracchus's son, the Gracchi. Right? And the two sons who are on the left in orange and red will grow up to be leaders of Rome. This is during the Republican period, right? During the period of freedom and elective governments. And in particular, these two sons of Gracchus, the Gracchi brothers, are noted for having fought for human rights. They believed in the rights of the common man as well, which is a theme that's everywhere at the end of the 18th century. Even England, who's lost America for probably that exact same reason. Right? So looking back to the 2nd century, Kauffmann gives us an image of Cornelia with her two sons who will grow up to be great leaders of Rome, virtuous, moral leaders of Rome, right? Not Caligula or something like that, right? And what Kauffmann is focusing on is the virtue of motherhood. She's got her daughter as well, and the story is that Cornelia's neighbor, the woman seated in red, has come to visit her. And the neighbor sounds like something you'd see in a sitcom. She's sort of this snarky-ass neighbor, comes in with her jewel box, right? I'm over here to visit. Look what I brought with me. I just happen to have my jewels. She opens up her box, and she's just showing off how wealthy she is. Look at this. I got this, right? Look at this chain. And Cornelia's kind of nonplussed by all of this, right? It doesn't really affect her that much as the neighbor's going on about all the wonderful things that she owns. And so she's finally kind of gets weary of sort of showing off her stuff, and she says, Cornelia, okay, Cornelia, you've seen mine. Where are your jewels? Cornelia goes, why, they're right here. and income the sons, right? So where are her priorities, right? She is the virtuous mother, and if you know Roman history, you realize that the kids are going to grow up to be virtuous leaders. Why? Because they have a great mom, right? She taught them properly. What's fascinating about that is the way in which Kaufman sort of lays this out for us. Cornelia gestures to the two sons, who we know will both grow up to be good, right? And it's through her maternal care, her instruction, that they get there in the first place. And she points down to them, and one of them doesn't look all that good at all. It's a nasty little bugger, right? The one in red. But I think it's because what we're looking at is the passing down of wisdom. The older child has received more of it yet, and the younger child less of it. But at the same time, the older child is going to play a role, as mom is, in the education of the younger child. Right? So the family is brought up to understand the importance of this and to help pass it on to other members of the family. And that's part of Angelica Kaufman's message, right? That's coming through here. And again, it's intended as an exemplum virtutis for us to think about the importance of proper child rearing, proper education, and locating it in the family, right? It's not in a boarding school. It's mom directly involved. And we see the fruits of that through the child in orange. We see him help her pass those fruits on to his younger brother. Okay? Daughters, they don't, sorry ladies, in Roman history they don't matter, right? And so she can be as interested as she wants in those jewels, right? Again, an exemplum virtutis. This particular image and others like it can be tied directly back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, our great. So we have two great French philosophes. There's Voltaire on the one hand, advocates studying history, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau will come up a couple different times. One in that he strongly believed that the family was important for developing good citizens. That current social practices, which included wet nursing, right, and boarding schools, that these practices were instrumental in breaking down the moral quality of the next generation. And he said, we can produce better citizens if they are, one, nursed by their own mother, as if there's something biological in the milk, but the idea of maternal care, right? And two, educated at home rather than sent off to live with somebody else. These would help to produce, as the study of history does, a greater, more virtuous citizenry. Kaufman's image ties directly into that. Right? One last picture quickly, and then we'll quit. Another British work in the Smithsonian American Museum. And by the way, VMFA is Richmond, right? Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, which is free, by the way, your tax dollars at work. Benjamin West, also a British artist, grew up in the colonies, right, here in America, moved back to England as tensions got tighter between Britain and the colonies as we're gearing up to war. Back in England, he became the court painter to the king, King George III, right? He is appointed as the one painter to paint history paintings for him. And here we have an image of the past as a mirror for the present in a much more direct way. Not only an exemplum virtutis, it's just a straightforward allegory, right? In this case, 1776. Do we have to say what year that is? Right? What's happening in England in 1776? They're losing America, right? The War of Independence is fought in 1776, right? The Declaration of Independence is declared, right? This painting was painted just before that as West, who knows it's tense, he knows there are problems, and he gives us an image from ancient history, Helen brought to Paris, to show us an allegory for what's happening right now. Now, Helen brought to Paris. Neoclassical art. Claude Lorrain, this is on one of the. Paris is a shepherd. The Greek god Zeus challenges him to decide which of the three goddesses is the most beautiful, right? Each one of them tries to sway his opinion by giving him gifts, right? Power, knowledge, beauty, love, right? That's what they offer him. And Venus offers him love and wins, right? And she offers him the most beautiful woman in the world, right? If you choose me, I'll give you the most beautiful woman in the world. And okay, that's it. The other one offers all the knowledge in the world, the other one offers all the power in the world. He goes for love, right? And the most beautiful woman in the world, he says, is Helen. Helen of Troy, right? But he's a Spartan, right? He's a Greek. So she is now delivered by the queen to him, and this sparks the Trojan War, right? This is what leads to the Trojan horse and all of that, right? So Helen being delivered by Venus, Venus is in a cloud on the right, Helen in all white, being grabbed by Cupid and yanked on over, being brought to now Paris, the shepherd boy, the Spartan. This is an allegory, isn't it? It's a very direct and straightforward allegory. What's happening here is the beginnings of war. We should be worried about the beginnings of war. Not that there's any Helen of Troy out there in the 18th century that this is all circling around, but war is pending here, right? And there are things that are going on that might seem relatively innocent, but they are going to lead somewhere bad, right? And even as that red curtain's pulled back, you'll notice the shadow it casts goes right across the face of Cupid, right? The shadows of war are coming. So again, neoclassicism, right, is this idea of the past mirrors the present. Whether it's for you as an individual, learning an exemplum virtutis, or whether it's scenes that remind us that what happened once could very well happen again. We've got a couple more neoclassical works to look at, and we'll move on to Romanticism. But again, no class on Tuesday because I'll be out of town. We'll pick this up a week from today. If you came in late, remember what I said at the beginning of class is that I really need the progress reports on the due date, but the worksheets you can postpone as you balance your work for the end of the weekend because I'm not going to grade everything on Saturday. Right? And it was wrong of me to make them all do the same thing. Okay? Good. And if you're already done, you're ahead of the game. So stop pouting. I finished already.